It was the most sacred object in the ancient world, a golden chest that contained the presence of God himself. The Ark of the Covenant travelled with the Israelites through 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, led armies to victory, brought down the walls of Jericho, and struck dead anyone who touched it without authorization. For centuries it rested in the Holy of Holies, the innermost sanctuary of Solomon's Temple in Jerusalem, visited only once a year by the high priest on the Day of Atonement, and then it vanished. Sometime around 586 BCE, when the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem and burned the temple to the ground, the Ark of the Covenant disappeared from history. No ancient source records its destruction. No conquering army claimed it as a trophy. It simply ceased to exist in the historical record, leaving behind one of the greatest mysteries of the ancient world. For over 2,500 years, people have searched for it, theorized about it, and dreamed of finding it. If you're settling in for the night, this is exactly the kind of mystery that works perfectly for sleep. Ancient temples and golden treasures, priests and kings and prophets. The greatest mystery of biblical archaeology waiting to be solved. If you enjoy it, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next journey into forgotten history. And if you want to tell me where you're listening from tonight, drop a comment. I love knowing that someone in Jerusalem and someone in London and someone on the other side of the world are all drifting off to the same ancient dreams together. Now let's go back over 3,000 years to the wilderness of Sinai, where a nation of former slaves received instructions for building the most important object they would ever possess. The story of the Ark begins at Mount Sinai, where according to the book of Exodus, Moses received not only the Ten Commandments, but detailed instructions for constructing a portable sanctuary and the sacred objects it would contain. The Ark was to be the centerpiece of this sanctuary, a chest made of acacia wood overlaid with pure gold inside and out. Its dimensions were precise, 2.5 cubits long, 1.5 cubits wide, and 1.5 cubits high, roughly 45 inches by 27 inches by 27 inches in modern measurements. A gold moulding ran around its rim, and 4 gold rings were attached to its corners, 2 on each side, through which gold-covered wooden poles would be inserted for carrying. The poles were never to be removed, a detail that emphasized the Ark's portability and the prohibition against touching it directly. The cover of the Ark, called the Kaperet in Hebrew and often translated as the mercy seat, was made of pure gold and featured 2 cherubim, angelic figures whose wings stretched upward and toward each other, creating a space above the cover where God's presence would dwell. This was the specific location where God promised to meet with Moses, speaking from between the 2 cherubim. The cherubim were not the chubby winged babies of Renaissance art, but fearsome guardian figures, similar to the sphinx-like creatures that decorated thrones and sacred spaces throughout the ancient Near East. Inside the Ark were placed the 2 stone tablets, on which God had inscribed the 10 Commandments, the foundational law of the covenant between God and Israel. Later traditions held that the Ark also contained a golden jar of manna, the miraculous bread that had sustained the Israelites in the wilderness, and Aaron's rod, the staff of Moses' brother, that had miraculously budded and produced almonds as a sign of his priestly authority. These 3 objects represented the covenant relationship from different angles, the law that Israel was obligated to follow, the provision that God had given them, and the priesthood that mediated between divine and human. The Ark was housed within a larger structure called the Tabernacle, a portable tent sanctuary that could be assembled and disassembled as the Israelites moved through the wilderness. The tabernacle was divided into 2 chambers. The outer chamber, called the Holy Place, contained the golden lampstand, the table of showbread, and the altar of incense. The inner chamber, called the Holy of Holies or the Most Holy Place, contained only the Ark, separated from the outer chamber by a heavy curtain. Only the high priest could enter the Holy of Holies, and only on 1 day per year, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. On that day, he would sprinkle sacrificial blood on the mercy seat to atone for the sins of the nation, entering the presence of God in the most direct way possible for a human being. The Ark was dangerous. The book of Leviticus records that Aaron's sons Nadab and Abihu died when they offered unauthorized fire before the Lord, a warning about the consequences of approaching God's presence improperly. The Ark radiated holiness that was deadly to those who were not authorized or prepared to encounter it. This was not holiness as modern people typically understand it, as moral purity or spiritual goodness, but holiness as raw divine power, as dangerous as electricity and demanding the same respect. The Levites, the tribe set apart for religious service, were responsible for transporting the ark when the Israelites moved camp. Even they could not touch it directly. They carried it by the poles that ran through its rings, and they covered it with multiple layers of cloth before moving it, shielding it from view. The transportation protocols were elaborate and strictly enforced, reflecting the ark's status as the most sacred object in existence, the actual dwelling place of God's presence on earth. During the wilderness period, the ark served as the visible center of God's guidance for the nation. When the cloud of God's presence lifted from the tabernacle, the people knew it was time to move. When the cloud settled, they made camp. The ark went before them as they traveled, symbolically leading the way into unknown territory. The Book of Numbers describes Moses calling out when the ark set out, asking God to arise and scatter his enemies, and calling out when it came to rest, asking God to return to the countless thousands of Israel. This language portrayed the ark as a throne from which God led his people, a mobile command center for divine operations. The military function of the ark became explicit during the conquest of Canaan under Joshua, Moses' successor. The crossing of the Jordan River was facilitated by the ark. When the priests carrying it stepped into the water, the river stopped flowing and the people crossed on dry ground, echoing the earlier miracle at the Red Sea. The conquest of Jericho, the first major military objective in Canaan, centered on the ark. For 6 days, the Israelite army marched around the city once each day, with the ark carried in the procession. On the 7th day, they marched around 7 times. The priests blew their trumpets, the people shouted, and the walls collapsed, allowing the Israelites to take the city. The ark was not merely a religious symbol accompanying the army, but an active participant in military operations, the presence of God going before his people to defeat their enemies. The power of the ark was not limited to helping Israel. The Book of Samuel records an episode where the Philistines, the perennial enemies of Israel, captured the ark in battle. They brought it to the temple of their god Dagon in Ashdod, placing it as a trophy before the idol. The next morning, the statue of Dagon was found fallen face down before the ark, as if bowing to it. The Philistines set the statue back up, but the following morning it had fallen again, this time with its head and hands broken off. The people of Ashdod were then afflicted with tumours, and a plague of mice devastated their crops. They sent the ark to another Philistine city, Gath, where the same afflictions followed. From Gath it went to Ekron, with the same results. After 7 months of suffering, the Philistines decided to return the ark to Israel, sending it on a cart pulled by 2 cows, along with golden offerings representing the tumours and mice that had plagued them. The cows, against their natural instincts, walked straight to the Israelite town of Beth Shemesh, confirming that the plagues had indeed been caused by the ark's presence. This story demonstrated that the power of the ark was not dependent on Israelite faith or Israelite possession. It was dangerous to everyone, friend and enemy alike, who did not treat it with proper reverence. The God of Israel was not a local deity whose power was limited to his own territory and people, but a universal power that could strike down foreign gods and afflict foreign nations. The ark's arrival at Beth Shemesh was not entirely happy for the Israelites either. The men of the town looked inside the ark, an act of forbidden curiosity, and 70 of them died as a result. The survivors, terrified, sent the ark to Kiriath Jearim, where it remained in the house of a man named Abinadab for 20 years. The ark had become an object that no one quite knew how to handle, too holy to keep but too dangerous to move. It was David, the shepherd who became king, who finally brought the ark to Jerusalem and made it the center of Israelite worship. David's conquest of Jerusalem from the Jebusites gave him a capital city that belonged to no particular tribe, a neutral location that could unite the northern and southern parts of his kingdom. Bringing the ark to Jerusalem accomplished a similar unification on the religious level, making the capital city also the religious center of the nation. But even David's first attempt to move the ark ended in disaster. He placed it on a new cart pulled by oxen, rather than having it carried by Levites with poles as the law prescribed. When the oxen stumbled and a man named Uzzah reached out to steady the ark, he was struck dead instantly. David was so frightened that he left the ark at the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite for 3 months before attempting to move it again. The second attempt followed the proper protocols, with Levites carrying the ark by its poles and sacrifices offered every 6 steps. David himself danced before the ark as it entered Jerusalem, wearing a linen ephod and celebrating with all his might. The ark was placed in a tent that David had prepared for it, a temporary arrangement until a proper temple could be built. David wanted to build that temple himself, but the prophet Nathan told him that God had other plans. David had been a man of war, with blood on his hands. His son would be a man of peace, and he would build a house for God's name. Solomon, David's son and successor, fulfilled this prophecy by constructing the temple in Jerusalem, one of the most magnificent buildings of the ancient world. The temple took 7 years to build, using the finest materials available. Cedar from Lebanon, stone quarried and dressed before being brought to the site so that no sound of hammer or chisel was heard during construction. Gold overlay on the interior walls and furnishings. The Holy of Holies in Solomon's temple was a perfect cube, 20 cubits in each dimension, roughly 30 feet on each side. The walls were covered with gold, and 2 enormous cherubim made of olive wood overlaid with gold stood in the chamber, their wings spanning the entire width of the room. The ark was placed beneath the wings of these cherubim, the poles extending far enough that their ends could be seen from the holy place, but not from outside. When the ark was installed, a cloud filled the temple, and the glory of the Lord was so intense that the priests could not continue their ministrations. Solomon declared that God had said he would dwell in thick darkness, and that he had built a house for God to dwell in forever. The temple became the fixed center of Israelite worship, replacing the portable tabernacle that had served during the wilderness period and the centuries of settlement. Pilgrims came to Jerusalem for the 3 major festivals each year. Sacrifices were offered daily on the altar in the temple courtyard. The high priest entered the Holy of Holies once a year on Yom Kippur to make atonement for the sins of the nation. The ark sat at the heart of this system, the invisible throne of the invisible God, the meeting point between heaven and earth. Solomon's temple stood for approximately 400 years, from its dedication around 960 BCE to its destruction by the Babylonians in 586 BCE. During those centuries, the temple experienced periods of neglect, reform, desecration, and restoration. The biblical narrative records multiple occasions when foreign influences corrupted worship in Jerusalem, when kings allowed or encouraged the worship of other gods, when the temple treasury was raided to pay tribute to foreign powers. There were also periods of renewal, when reforming kings like Hezekiah and Josiah purged the temple of foreign elements and restored proper worship. Josiah's reform in the late 7th century BCE was particularly significant because it was triggered by the discovery of the Book of the Law in the temple, a document that had apparently been lost or forgotten during the years of neglect. Josiah was devastated when the book was read to him, recognizing how far the nation had strayed from its covenant obligations. He instituted sweeping reforms, destroying the high places where worship had been conducted outside Jerusalem, removing the foreign gods and their priests, and centralizing all worship in the temple. Throughout all these changes, the ark presumably remained in the Holy of Holies, though it is rarely mentioned in the historical books after Solomon's time. The silence is striking. If the ark had been removed, damaged, or destroyed during any of the periods of apostasy or foreign invasion, we might expect the biblical writers to have noted it. The fact that they do not mention it suggests that it remained in place, quietly present at the center of the temple's holiness, until the final catastrophe. The kingdom that Solomon had built did not survive intact. After his death, the northern tribes rebelled against his son Rehoboam, splitting the nation into 2 kingdoms, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. Jerusalem and the temple remained with Judah, the southern kingdom, while the northern kingdom established its own religious centers at Dan and Bethel. The northern kingdom was conquered by the Assyrians in 722 BCE, its population deported and scattered. The famous lost 10 tribes of Israel. The southern kingdom survived for another century and a half, a small state caught between the great powers of Egypt and Mesopotamia, sometimes allied with one, sometimes with the other, always vulnerable. The Babylonian Empire, which had replaced Assyria as the dominant power in Mesopotamia, turned its attention to the small kingdoms of the Levant in the early 6th century BCE. King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon besieged Jerusalem in 597 BCE, capturing the young king Jehoiakim and deporting him to Babylon along with thousands of the nation's elite. He installed Jehoiakim's uncle Zedekiah as a puppet king, but Zedekiah eventually rebelled, leading to a second siege that ended in 586 BCE with the complete destruction of Jerusalem. The temple was burned, its treasures carried off to Babylon, its walls demolished. The population was either killed, deported, or fled to Egypt. the kingdom of Judah ceased to exist as an independent state. The Book of Kings provides a detailed inventory of the temple treasures that the Babylonians took: the bronze pillars, the bronze sea, the stands, the pots, the shovels, the snuffers, the dishes, the pans, all the bronze vessels used in the temple service. The gold and silver items are mentioned separately. The list is comprehensive and specific, documenting the systematic looting of everything valuable in the temple. But the Ark of the Covenant is not mentioned. This silence has generated endless speculation. If the Babylonians had taken the Ark, surely the biblical writers would have recorded such a catastrophic loss. If they had destroyed it, that too would merit mention. The most natural reading of the evidence is that the Ark was not in the temple when the Babylonians arrived, that it had already been removed, hidden, or destroyed before the final siege. But when? And by whom? And where did it go? These questions have no definitive answers, only theories that range from the plausible to the fantastic. The Second Temple, built after the Jews returned from Babylonian exile, did not contain the Ark. This is one of the few things we know for certain about its fate. When the exiles returned to Jerusalem under Persian authorization in 538 BCE, they rebuilt the temple on a more modest scale than Solomon's original structure. The Second Temple was dedicated around 516 BCE, exactly 70 years after the destruction of the First Temple, fulfilling the prophecy of Jeremiah. But the Holy of Holies in this new temple was empty. The Ark was not there. Ancient sources confirm this absence. The Babylonian Talmud states that 5 things were present in the First Temple, but absent from the Second: the Ark, the sacred fire, the divine presence, the Holy Spirit, and the Urim and Thummim. The Roman historian Tacitus, describing the conquest of Jerusalem by the Roman general Pompey in 63 BCE, noted that when Pompey entered the Holy of Holies, he found it empty, contrary to rumours that the Jews kept a golden donkey's head or some other idol there. The absence of any cult image confirmed the Jewish commitment to an imageless worship of an invisible God, but it also confirmed that the Ark was gone. The rabbis developed various explanations for this absence. Some held that King Josiah, foreseeing the destruction of the temple, had hidden the Ark in a chamber beneath the Temple Mount, where it remained waiting to be revealed in the Messianic age. This tradition is recorded in the Mishnah, which states that when the Ark was hidden, the jar of manna, the flask of anointing oil, Aaron's rod, and the chest containing the Philistines' golden offerings were hidden with it. The location was said to be in the woodshed, where a priest once noticed that one of the floor stones was different from the others, indicating the entrance to the hidden chamber. Before he could tell anyone, he died, confirming that the hiding place was meant to remain secret. Other rabbinic traditions held that the Ark was taken to Babylon and never returned, or that it was hidden on Mount Nebo by the prophet Jeremiah, or that it would only be revealed when the Messiah came to restore Israel. The apocryphal Second Book of Maccabees, written in the 2nd century BCE, contains a tradition about Jeremiah hiding the Ark. According to this account, Jeremiah received a divine oracle instructing him to take the tent and the Ark and go to the mountain where Moses had ascended to see the inheritance of God. Jeremiah went and found a cave, and he placed the tent, the Ark, and the altar of incense inside it, then blocked up the entrance. Some of those who followed him tried to mark the path so they could return, but they could not find it. When Jeremiah learned this, he rebuked them, saying that the place would remain unknown until God gathered his people together again and showed his mercy. Then the Lord would disclose these things, and the glory of the Lord and the cloud would appear, as they had in the time of Moses and when Solomon prayed that the temple might be greatly sanctified. This tradition locates the Ark on Mount Nebo, on the eastern side of the Jordan River, in what is now the Kingdom of Jordan. Mount Nebo is traditionally identified as the place where Moses viewed the Promised Land before his death, making it a symbolically appropriate location for hiding objects associated with him. Some modern seekers have taken this tradition seriously, exploring caves on Mount Nebo in search of the hidden Ark, though no discoveries have been confirmed. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church claims to possess the Ark of the Covenant, a claim that is central to Ethiopian Christian identity and practice. According to Ethiopian tradition, the Ark was brought to Ethiopia by Menelik I, the son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. When the Queen of Sheba visited Solomon to test his wisdom, as recorded in the Bible, she conceived a son by him. This son, Menelik, later travelled to Jerusalem to meet his father and was received with great honour. When he returned to Ethiopia, he brought the Ark with him, either as a gift from Solomon or, in some versions of the tradition, taken without Solomon's knowledge by priests who accompanied Menelik. The Ark has supposedly remained in Ethiopia ever since, housed in the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Aksum, the ancient capital of the Ethiopian kingdom. The church does not allow anyone to see the Ark. It is guarded by a single monk who is appointed for life and never leaves the chapel where it is kept. Replicas of the Ark, called tabots, are used in every Ethiopian Orthodox church, carried in procession during festivals and treated with great reverence. The Ethiopian claim is often dismissed by Western scholars as a late medieval legend developed to legitimize the Ethiopian monarchy and establish a connection between Ethiopia and biblical Israel. The earliest written version of the story comes from the Kebra Nagast, a 14th century Ethiopian text that presents itself as a translation of an older Coptic work. However, some researchers have argued that the tradition may preserve authentic historical memory, that the Ark could have been taken to Ethiopia during one of the periods when the temple was desecrated or threatened, perhaps during the reign of Manasseh, who placed an idol in the temple, or during the Babylonian crisis. The problem is that the Ethiopian Church will not allow any scientific examination of the object they claim is the Ark, making verification impossible. The Temple Mount in Jerusalem remains the most likely location for the Ark if it was hidden rather than destroyed or taken. The Temple Mount is a massive platform constructed by King Herod in the 1st century BCE, but it incorporates earlier structures dating back to Solomon's time and possibly earlier. Beneath the visible surface are chambers, tunnels, and cisterns that have never been fully explored. Jewish tradition, as noted above, holds that Josiah hid the Ark somewhere beneath the Temple Mount. Some modern theories elaborate on this, suggesting specific locations such as a chamber beneath the rock at the centre of the Dome of the Rock, which Muslims believe is the place where Muhammad ascended to heaven, and which Jews identify as the foundation stone, the Even Hashtaya, the point from which God created the world. Excavation beneath the Temple Mount is politically impossible due to the site's religious sensitivity. The mount is controlled by the Islamic Waqf, the Muslim religious trust that administers the site, and any archaeological investigation would provoke enormous controversy. Israeli archaeologists have conducted excavations around the perimeter of the Temple Mount, revealing structures from various periods, but they have not been allowed to dig beneath the platform itself. The tunnels that run along the western wall have been explored and open to tourists, but these do not penetrate to the areas where the Ark might be hidden. Some religious Jews believe that the Ark should not be sought until the Messiah comes, that human efforts to find it would be presumptuous. Others believe that finding the Ark would be a prerequisite for rebuilding the temple and restoring proper worship. The intersection of archaeology, religion, and politics makes the Temple Mount perhaps the most contested 35 acres on Earth. The destruction of Jerusalem and the Temple in 586 BCE was one of the most traumatic events in ancient Jewish history, a catastrophe that shaped Jewish identity and theology for millennia afterward. The Babylonian exile that followed lasted approximately 50 years, during which the Jewish community in Babylon developed new forms of religious practice that did not depend on the temple and its sacrifices. The synagogue, the prayer service, the study of Torah, the observance of Sabbath and festivals without pilgrimage to Jerusalem, all of these adaptations emerge from the necessity of maintaining Jewish identity in a foreign land without access to the traditional centre of worship. When the exiles returned to Jerusalem, they brought these innovations with them, creating a Judaism that could survive and even thrive without the temple, a resilience that would prove essential after the Second Temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE. The prophets who lived through the Babylonian crisis interpreted it as divine judgment for Israel's sins, particularly the sins of idolatry, injustice, and covenant unfaithfulness. Jeremiah, who had warned of the coming destruction for decades before it arrived, also proclaimed that God would make a new covenant with Israel, writing his law on their hearts rather than on tablets of stone. Ezekiel, who was among the exiles in Babylon, had a vision of the glory of God departing from the temple before its destruction, rising up from the cherubim and moving to the threshold, then leaving the temple entirely and standing on the mountain east of the city. This vision suggested that God's presence was not permanently bound to the temple or the ark, that he could leave when his people's sins made the sanctuary unfit for his dwelling, and that he could return when conditions were right. The theology of divine presence underwent significant development during and after the exile. In the earliest biblical traditions, God's presence was localized in specific places: the burning bush, Mount Sinai, the ark, the temple. The ark was the concrete embodiment of this localized presence, the the actual place where God dwelt among his people. After the exile, Jewish theology increasingly emphasized God's transcendence, his presence everywhere rather than in one particular place. The synagogue, unlike the temple, did not claim to house God's presence in any special way. It was simply a place where Jews gathered to pray and study. This shift did not mean that the temple lost its significance, as the Second Temple remained the center of Jewish worship for nearly 6 centuries, but it did mean that Jewish identity was no longer as dependent on a single location and a single sacred object as it had been. The loss of the Ark was thus both traumatic and liberating, forcing a theological development that ultimately made Judaism more portable and resilient. The Ark had been the visible symbol of God's covenant presence. Its absence required Jews to find other ways of understanding and experiencing that presence, ways that could survive the loss of any physical object or location. This development was not complete at the time of the Second Temple. Many Jews still expected a restored temple with a restored Ark in the Messianic age, but the seeds of a Judaism that could survive without temple or Ark had been planted during the Babylonian exile and would flower after the destruction of the Second Temple. The Romans destroyed the Second Temple in 70 CE, ending the sacrificial system that had been central to Jewish worship for a millennium. The destruction was documented by the Jewish historian Josephus, who witnessed it as a captive of the Roman general Titus. According to Josephus, the temple treasures were carried to Rome, where they were displayed in Titus's triumph and then deposited in the Temple of Peace. The Arch of Titus in Rome, erected to commemorate the victory, includes a relief showing Roman soldiers carrying the menorah, the golden lampstand, and other temple vessels in triumphal procession. The Ark is not depicted, confirming that it was not in the temple when the Romans captured it. The Second Temple had stood for nearly 6 centuries without the Ark, and the Romans found no trace of it. The loss of the Second Temple completed the transformation of Judaism from a temple-centered religion to a Torah-centered religion. The rabbis who shaped Judaism after 70 CE developed the legal interpretations and ethical teachings that would guide Jewish life without sacrifice, without priests performing their ancient functions, without the pilgrimage festivals centered on Jerusalem. They preserved detailed memories of the temple and its rituals, creating a body of literature that would allow future generations to rebuild the temple if the opportunity arose. But they also created a fully functional Judaism that could exist indefinitely without it. The Ark remained a powerful symbol in this literature, an object of longing and hope, but not a necessity for Jewish survival. The centuries between the destruction of the Second Temple and the rise of modern archaeology saw the Ark pass from historical memory into legend and speculation. Medieval Jewish commentators discussed the various traditions about its fate, without being able to add new information. Christian writers incorporated the Ark into their theological systems, interpreting it as a foreshadowing of Christ and the Virgin Mary. The mercy seat, where God's presence dwelt, prefigured Christ as the place where divine and human met. The Ark itself, containing the law, the manna, and Aaron's rod, prefigured Mary, who contained Christ, the living bread, the eternal high priest. These allegorical interpretations did not depend on the Ark's physical existence. Indeed, its mysterious disappearance made it a more powerful symbol, an object whose meaning transcended its material reality. Islamic tradition also acknowledged the Ark, which is mentioned in the Quran in connection with the story of Saul and David. The Quran calls it the tabut, the chest, and says that it contained relics left by the families of Moses and Aaron, and was carried by angels. Some Islamic traditions hold that the Ark will be discovered near the end of time, when the Mahdi, the guided one, appears to restore justice on earth. The precise location and fate of the Ark are not specified in Islamic sources, leaving room for the same speculation that characterizes Jewish and Christian traditions. The Knights Templar, the medieval military order that protected Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land, have been linked to the Ark in popular imagination, though not in serious historical research. The Templars were headquartered on the Temple Mount for nearly 2 centuries, from 1119 until their expulsion by Saladin in 1187. During this time, they conducted some excavation beneath the mount, though the extent and findings of this excavation are not documented. Later legends, particularly those developed after the suppression of the Templars in 1307, credited them with discovering ancient treasures, including the Holy Grail, the True Cross, and the Ark of the Covenant. These legends have no historical basis. They emerge from the mystery surrounding the Templars' sudden fall from power and the accusations of heresy levelled against them. The idea that the Templars discovered and hid the Ark has been popularized by numerous books and films, but is not taken seriously by historians or archaeologists. The same applies to theories linking the Ark to the Freemasons, who claim symbolic descent from the builders of Solomon's Temple, but have no actual connection to it. The modern search for the Ark of the Covenant began in earnest in the 19th century, when Western explorers and archaeologists turned their attention to the lands of the Bible. The Palestine Exploration Fund, established in Britain in 1865, sponsored systematic surveys and excavations in the Holy Land, including work around Jerusalem and the Temple Mount. Charles Warren, a British officer who later became famous as the police commissioner during the Jack the Ripper murders, conducted extensive excavations around the Temple Mount in the late 1860s, discovering the shafts and tunnels that still bear his name. Warren explored the underground spaces around the platform, documenting cisterns, passageways, and structural features, but he did not find the Ark or any indication of its location. His work, and that of subsequent explorers, established the complexity of the subterranean landscape beneath and around the Temple Mount, showing that there were plenty of places where something could be hidden, but providing no evidence that anything had been. The discovery of ancient Near Eastern civilizations through archaeology transformed understanding of the biblical world in the 19th and 20th centuries. The excavation of Assyrian and Babylonian sites revealed the empires that had conquered Israel and Judah, providing independent confirmation of events recorded in the Bible and filling in historical context that the biblical writers had taken for granted. The decipherment of cuneiform and hieroglyphics opened up vast literatures that illuminated the cultural background of the Bible. Archaeologists found parallels to biblical laws, stories, and rituals throughout the ancient Near East, showing that Israel was part of a broader cultural world even as it developed distinctive beliefs and practices. This research did not locate the Ark, but it did establish the historical reality of the world in which the Ark had existed. The excavation of ancient Israelite sites provided tangible evidence for the biblical narrative, though rarely the dramatic discoveries that capture public imagination. Archaeologists found city walls, gates, palaces, and temples that corresponded to biblical descriptions. They found inscriptions mentioning biblical kings and events. They found artifacts that illustrated daily life in ancient Israel: pottery, tools, weapons, seals, jewelry. What they did not find were the great sacred objects of Israelite religion. No ark, no cherubim, no golden lampstand, no tablets of the law. This absence is not surprising. Such objects would have been prime targets for looters and conquerors throughout history, and even if they survived destruction, they would be virtually impossible to identify without inscriptions or other clear markers. A gold-covered wooden chest found in an archaeological excavation could be many things. Without the tablets inside or some other definitive evidence, it could not be positively identified as the Ark of the Covenant. The archaeology of Jerusalem has been particularly challenging due to the continuous occupation of the city for thousands of years. Ancient structures lie buried beneath medieval, Ottoman, and modern buildings, accessible only when construction or renovation provides opportunities for salvage excavation. The Temple Mount itself, as noted, is largely off-limits to archaeologists. Work in the Jewish quarter after 1967 revealed impressive remains from the Second Temple period, including luxurious houses destroyed during the Roman conquest, but nothing from the time of Solomon or the First Temple. The City of David, the oldest part of Jerusalem located south of the Temple Mount, has been excavated extensively, revealing fortifications, water systems, and other structures from the Iron Age, but again nothing that illuminates the fate of the Ark. Ron Wyatt, an American amateur archaeologist, claimed in the 1980s to have discovered the Ark of the Covenant beneath the site of the crucifixion in Jerusalem. According to Wyatt, he found a chamber containing the Ark, the tablets of the law, and other temple furnishings. He also claimed that Christ's blood had dripped through a crack in the rock onto the mercy seat, providing a literal fulfillment of the symbolism of the Day of Atonement. Wyatt's claims were not taken seriously by professional archaeologists or biblical scholars, who noted numerous problems with his account, including the impossibility of verifying his claims, the theological conveniences of his discoveries, and the lack of any corroborating evidence. Wyatt made numerous other sensational claims during his career, including discoveries of Noah's Ark, the Red Sea crossing site, Sodom and Gomorrah, and the true Mount Sinai, none of which have been confirmed by subsequent investigation. His influence persists among some evangelical Christians who are eager to find physical proof of biblical narratives, but who lack the critical tools to evaluate extraordinary claims. The Vendell Jones expedition, led by an American who inspired some elements of the Indiana Jones character, searched for the Ark and other temple treasures in the caves near Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. Jones believed that the Copper Scroll, one of the Dead Sea Scrolls that lists hidden treasures and their locations, provided clues to the whereabouts of temple artifacts hidden before the Roman destruction. His excavations uncovered some interesting finds, including a substance he identified as the anointing oil from the temple, but not the Ark, or anything definitively connected to it. The Copper Scroll remains a puzzle for scholars. Its list of treasures seems too vast to be real, yet it is written on copper rather than leather or papyrus, suggesting unusual importance. Whether it describes actual hidden treasures or is some kind of literary exercise remains debated. The most sustained modern search for the Ark has been the Ethiopian claim, which has attracted various investigators over the years. Graham Hancock, a British journalist, wrote a popular book arguing that the Ethiopian claim deserves serious consideration. Hancock traced a possible route by which the Ark could have reached Ethiopia, suggesting it was taken from Jerusalem during the reign of Manasseh, kept on the island of Elephantine in southern Egypt, and eventually brought to Ethiopia. His reconstruction is speculative, relying on circumstantial evidence and interpretations that most scholars find unconvincing. The fundamental problem remains that the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion will not allow any examination of the object they claim is the Ark. Without examination, the claim can neither be verified nor definitively refuted. Defenders of the Ethiopian tradition argue that the refusal to show the Ark is itself evidence of its authenticity. If it were a medieval forgery, why not display it and settle the question? Critics respond that the refusal is precisely what we would expect if the object is not what it claims to be, or if it is too fragile or undistinguished to support the weight of the tradition. The standoff continues with no resolution in sight. The Ethiopian Church has no reason to change its policy, since the mystery enhances rather than diminishes the Ark's significance in Ethiopian religious life. Western investigators have no means of compelling access to an object protected by religious authority and national sovereignty. The physical construction of the Ark, as described in the biblical text, raises interesting questions about what we would expect to find if it were discovered. The core was acacia wood, a dense hardwood native to the Sinai Peninsula and the Levant. Acacia is durable and resistant to decay, but wood does not survive indefinitely, especially in the climates of the Middle East. After 2,500 years or more, we would expect the wooden core to have deteriorated significantly, perhaps entirely, leaving only the gold overlay. Gold does not corrode, so the outer shell could theoretically survive indefinitely under the right conditions. The mercy seat and cherubim, if they were solid gold as some interpretations suggest, could also survive. The contents are more problematic. Stone tablets could survive almost indefinitely, as stone is highly durable. The jar of manna and Aaron's rod, being organic materials, would likely have decayed completely. If the Ark were found intact with its contents, the presence of stone tablets would be the most significant discovery, potentially bearing text in ancient Hebrew that could be compared with known inscriptions and biblical manuscripts. The absence of organic contents would not disprove authenticity, as their decay would be expected. But the presence of the tablets would be extraordinary confirmation. The question of what the Ark looked like has generated considerable artistic speculation over the centuries, most of it based more on imagination than on the biblical text. Medieval and Renaissance artists typically depicted the Ark as a rectangular chest with a peaked lid, sometimes resembling a church building, with the cherubim as angels with wings and human faces. This imagery reflects European Christian iconography, more than ancient Near Eastern art. The cherubim of the ancient Near East were composite creatures, often with human heads, lion bodies, and eagle wings, similar to the Sphinx or the Assyrian Lamassu. The biblical text describes the cherubim on the Ark as having wings that spread upward and faces that look toward each other and toward the mercy seat, but it does not describe their bodies in detail. The cherubim that Solomon placed in the Holy of Holies were made of olive wood overlaid with gold and had wingspans of 5 cubits each, but their overall form is not specified. Archaeological discoveries from the region provide some parallels. Carved ivories from Samaria and Nimrud depict winged creatures that may resemble the biblical cherubim. Egyptian art shows the winged goddesses Isis and Nephthys protecting the mummy of Osiris, in poses similar to what the biblical cherubim might have looked like. The ark itself, as a portable throne or footstool for an invisible deity, has parallels in other ancient Near Eastern cultures, where deities were sometimes represented by empty thrones or other symbolic furniture rather than by statues. The dimensions of the ark, approximately 4 feet by 2.5 feet by 2.5 feet, make it a substantial but portable object. It could be carried by 4 men using the poles, as described in the biblical accounts of its transportation. It was not so large that it could not fit through doorways or be maneuvered in confined spaces. The gold overlay would add significant weight. Gold is one of the densest metals, and even a thin layer over the entire surface would add dozens of pounds. The traditional estimate is that the ark weighed somewhere between 300 and 500 pounds, heavy but manageable for 4 strong men with poles. The prohibition against touching the ark directly, combined with the requirement that the poles remain permanently in place, suggests that the Israelites understood the dangers of handling sacred objects. The story of Uzzah, struck dead for touching the ark even to prevent it from falling, reinforced this understanding with a memorable example. The ark was not an object to be treated casually or handled without proper precautions. The golden contents of the temple, including the ark and its related furnishings, represented enormous wealth by ancient standards. Gold was the most precious metal, valued for its beauty, durability, and rarity. The amount of gold used in the tabernacle and later the temple was prodigious. The biblical texts list the weights of precious metals contributed by the Israelites for the construction, totaling over a ton of gold and several tons of silver. Even allowing for exaggeration in these figures, the temple treasures represented a national fortune, accumulated over centuries and constantly augmented by donations and tribute. This wealth made the temple a target for plunderers throughout its history. The Bible records multiple occasions when kings of Israel and Judah raided the temple treasury to pay tribute to foreign powers or to finance military ventures. Foreign conquerors, from Pharaoh Shishak in the 10th century BCE to Nebuchadnezzar in the 6th, carried off temple treasures as the spoils of war. The gold of the ark, if it survived all these depredations, would have been a prime target for the Babylonians or any subsequent looters. The religious significance of the ark transcended its material value. It was the place where heaven and earth met, where the invisible God of Israel made his presence known. The tablets it contained were the foundational document of the covenant between God and Israel, the words God himself had spoken and inscribed. The manna and Aaron's rod were physical evidence of God's provision and authority. Losing the ark was not just losing a valuable object, but losing the visible center of the relationship between God and his people. The silence of the sources about the ark's fate may reflect the trauma of this loss, a wound too painful to describe in detail. The priests and scribes who compiled the historical books of the Bible knew what had happened to Jerusalem and the temple. They could describe the burning of the temple and the carrying away of its treasures. But they could not or would not describe what happened to the ark. Perhaps they did not know. Perhaps they knew, but found the knowledge too painful to record. Perhaps the ark had been hidden, and they wanted to protect its location from future enemies. Whatever the reason, their silence has fueled speculation for millennia. Solomon's Temple, the house that held the ark for 4 centuries, was one of the great architectural achievements of the ancient world, though we must reconstruct its appearance from biblical descriptions rather than archaeological remains. The temple was built on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite, which David had purchased as the site for an altar to the Lord. This location, on the highest point of the ridge that formed the city of David, later became the Temple Mount, expanded and monumentalized by successive builders until Herod's massive platform created the 35-acre site that exists today. Solomon's original temple was relatively small by later standards, about 90 feet long, 30 feet wide, and 45 feet high, roughly the size of a small church. But it was built with extraordinary care and lavish materials, taking 7 years to complete even with the resources of a powerful kingdom and the assistance of skilled Phoenician craftsmen. The temple was oriented east to west, with the entrance facing east toward the Mount of Olives. Worshippers would enter through a portico flanked by 2 bronze pillars named Jachin and Boaz, pass through the holy place with its lampstand, altar of incense, and table of showbread, and approach the curtain that separated the holy place from the Holy of Holies. Only the high priest could pass through that curtain, and only once a year. The Holy of Holies, a perfect cube overlaid with gold, contained nothing but the ark with its guardian cherubim. The cedar used in the temple came from Lebanon, transported by sea and overland at enormous expense. Lebanon was famous in the ancient world for its cedars, which grew tall and straight and provided timber superior to anything available in the Levant. The scent of cedar was associated with divinity and luxury throughout the ancient Near East. Temples and palaces were built with cedar to honor the gods and impress human visitors. Solomon's alliance with Hiram of Tyre, the Phoenician king who controlled the cedar trade, was essential to the temple project. In exchange for timber and skilled craftsmen, Solomon provided Hiram with wheat and olive oil, the agricultural products of his kingdom. The relationship between Israel and Phoenicia would continue for generations, sometimes friendly, sometimes hostile, as the two small kingdoms navigated the political complexities of the region. The stone used in the temple was quarried locally and dressed at the quarry rather than at the building site. The biblical text emphasizes that no sound of hammer or chisel was heard at the temple during construction, a detail that underscores the sacred nature of the project. Every stone was shaped before being brought to the site, fitting together precisely without the need for on-site modification. This technique required extraordinary planning and craftsmanship, ensuring that each piece would be exactly the right size and shape for its intended position. The dedication of the temple was a moment of supreme religious significance, marking the transition from the portable tabernacle to a permanent house for God's presence. Solomon assembled all the elders and tribal leaders of Israel to witness the ark's installation in the Holy of Holies. The priest carried the ark from the tent where David had placed it, and the Levites brought the tabernacle and all its sacred furnishings. The number of sheep and cattle sacrificed on this occasion was so great that they could not be counted. When the priests emerged from the Holy of Holies after placing the ark beneath the wings of the great cherubim, a cloud filled the temple, the same cloud that had led the Israelites through the wilderness, the visible manifestation of God's presence. The glory of the Lord was so intense that the priest could not continue their service. Solomon then offered a prayer of dedication, acknowledging that heaven itself could not contain God, much less a house built by human hands, yet asking God to hear the prayers offered toward this place. He prayed for justice in legal disputes, for victory in battle, for rain in time of drought, for forgiveness when the people sinned. He prayed for foreigners who came to worship the God of Israel, that they too might know God's name. And he prayed for the people when they were carried away captive to a foreign land, that if they repented and prayed toward Jerusalem and the temple, God would hear and forgive. This prayer anticipated the exile that would come 4 centuries later, suggesting that the possibility of catastrophe was understood even at the moment of greatest triumph. The First Temple period, from Solomon's dedication around 960 BCE to the Babylonian destruction in 586 BCE, spanned approximately 4 centuries of Israelite and Judahite history. During this period, the unified kingdom split into 2. The northern kingdom fell to Assyria, the southern kingdom survived under a succession of kings good and bad, and the temple experienced periods of neglect, apostasy, and reform. The biblical narrative focuses on the religious faithfulness or unfaithfulness of each king, evaluating them primarily by their attitude toward the temple and the worship conducted there. Kings who allowed foreign worship or who neglected the temple are condemned. Kings who purged foreign influences and restored proper worship are praised. The greatest reformers were Hezekiah and Josiah, both of whom conducted major renovations of the temple and centralized worship in Jerusalem. Hezekiah's reform came in response to the Assyrian threat. He fortified Jerusalem, built the tunnel that still bears his name to secure the water supply, and trusted God to deliver the city. According to the biblical account, an angel of the Lord struck down 185,000 Assyrian soldiers in a single night, causing the Assyrian king Sennacherib to withdraw without capturing Jerusalem. This miraculous deliverance reinforced the belief that God protected his temple and his city, a belief that would be tested and apparently refuted by the Babylonian conquest a century later. Josiah's reform was even more thorough, triggered by the discovery of the Book of the Law during temple repairs. When the book was read to Josiah, he tore his robes in grief, recognizing how far the nation had strayed from its covenant obligations. He instituted a comprehensive purge, destroying the high places where unauthorized worship had been conducted, removing the vessels made for Baal and Asherah from the temple, deposing the priests who had conducted illegitimate worship, and defiling the altar at Bethel, where Jeroboam had established rival worship after the kingdom split. Josiah's reforms were the most sweeping in Judah's history, but they did not save the nation from judgment. The prophets Jeremiah and Zephaniah, who lived during Josiah's reign, still warned of coming destruction. Josiah himself died in battle against Pharaoh Necho of Egypt, and the kingdom that had seemed so promising under his rule fell into decline under his successors. Within 23 years of Josiah's death, Jerusalem would be destroyed, and the temple would be in ruins. The prophets who lived through the final decades of the First Temple period left vivid testimony to the crisis and its meaning. Jeremiah, who prophesied from the reign of Josiah through the destruction and beyond, warned repeatedly that Jerusalem would fall if the people did not repent. He was hated for his message, accused of treason, thrown into a cistern to die, yet he persisted in proclaiming the word of the Lord. Jeremiah's prophecies include some of the most profound reflections on the nature of true religion, distinguishing between outward ritual and inward devotion. He declared that the people trusted falsely in the temple, saying, "The temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord," as if the mere presence of the building would protect them regardless of their conduct. He reminded them of Shiloh, where the tabernacle had stood before David brought the ark to Jerusalem, a place that God had destroyed because of the people's wickedness. The temple would meet the same fate if the people did not change their ways. Jeremiah also prophesied that the ark itself would be forgotten. In a passage describing the future restoration, he declared that when the population had multiplied, people would no longer say, "the ark of the covenant of the Lord." It would not come to mind or be remembered or missed, and another would not be made. Jerusalem itself would be called the throne of the Lord, and all nations would gather there. This prophecy suggests that the physical ark would be superseded by a greater reality, that God's presence would no longer be localized in a golden box but would fill the entire city. Whether Jeremiah knew what had happened or would happen to the ark is unclear. His prophecy may be an explanation after the fact or a genuine prediction before the event. Ezekiel, a priest who was among the exiles taken to Babylon in 597 BCE, received visions that showed the departure of God's glory from the temple before its destruction. In Ezekiel's vision, the glory of the Lord, which had appeared to him by the river Chebar in Babylon, rose from the cherubim in the temple, paused at the threshold, and then departed from the city entirely, standing on the mountain east of Jerusalem. The vision suggested that God had already left the temple before the Babylonians arrived to destroy it, that the physical destruction was merely the confirmation of a spiritual abandonment that had already occurred. Ezekiel's visions also included detailed blueprints for a future temple, a structure even more magnificent than Solomon's, where the glory of the Lord would return from the east, entering through the gate that faced the direction from which it had departed. This eschatological temple has never been built. It remains a vision of hope for the future restoration that some Jews still anticipate. The vision includes descriptions of the Holy of Holies and its furnishings, but it does not mention the ark. Either the ark would be restored along with other features not explicitly described, or the future temple would not need an ark because God's presence would fill it in a different way. The destruction of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar was thorough and devastating. The siege lasted about 18 months, during which famine became so severe that people ate their own children. When the walls were finally breached, King Zedekiah fled by night, but was captured near Jericho. He was brought before Nebuchadnezzar at Riblah, where his sons were killed before his eyes, and then his eyes were put out, ensuring that the last thing he ever saw was the death of his dynasty. He was taken in chains to Babylon, where he eventually died. The temple was burned, its bronze pillars and furnishings broken up and carried to Babylon, its gold and silver treasures added to the imperial treasury. The walls of Jerusalem were demolished, and most of the surviving population was deported. Only the poorest people were left behind to work the land. The devastation was so complete that the site of the temple was abandoned for decades, the ruins serving only as a place of mourning and pilgrimage for those who remembered what had been. The Book of Lamentations, traditionally attributed to Jeremiah, captures the grief of those who witnessed the destruction. The poems describe the desolation of Jerusalem, once full of people, now sitting alone like a widow. The princess among the provinces become a slave. The roads to Zion mourn because no one comes to the festivals. All her gates are desolate, her priests groan. The enemy has triumphed. The young women and young men have gone into captivity. The Lord has become like an enemy. He has destroyed Israel. He has multiplied mourning and lamentation in the daughter of Judah. The sanctuary has been violated, foreigners entering the holy places where even Israelites were forbidden to go. The contrast between past glory and present devastation could not be more stark. Yet even in the midst of grief, the poet finds hope in God's faithfulness. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is his faithfulness. The Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the soul who seeks him. It is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. This hope, maintained in the darkest hour, would sustain the Jewish people through the exile and through subsequent catastrophes down to the present day. The Babylonian exile lasted approximately 50 years, from the destruction of the temple in 586 BCE to the decree of Cyrus permitting the Jews to return in 538 BCE. During this period, the exiled community maintained their identity and their hope for restoration. They gathered by the rivers of Babylon and wept when they remembered Zion. They hung their harps on the willows because their captors demanded songs of joy, but how could they sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? The Psalms of Exile express both the anguish of displacement and the determination to remember Jerusalem. If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget its skill. Let my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you, if I do not set Jerusalem above my highest joy. This fierce loyalty to a destroyed city and a ruined temple was the foundation on which the return and the rebuilding would be based. The exiles did not assimilate, they did not forget. They transmitted their traditions to their children and their children's children, waiting for the day when they could go home. The return from exile began in 538 BCE, when Cyrus the Great of Persia conquered Babylon and issued a decree permitting the Jews to return to their homeland and rebuild their temple. Cyrus was celebrated in the Bible as God's anointed, the shepherd who would fulfill God's purpose, even though he didn't know the God of Israel. The Persian policy of allowing subject peoples to maintain their traditional religions contrasted sharply with Assyrian and Babylonian policies of deportation and religious suppression. Under Persian rule, the Jews could return to Jerusalem, rebuild the temple, and worship according to their ancestral customs, all under the protection of imperial authority. The first wave of returnees, led by Sheshbazzar and later by Zerubbabel, a descendant of the Davidic dynasty, began the work of restoration. They rebuilt the altar first, resuming sacrifices on the site of the temple, even before the building itself was reconstructed. The foundation of the new temple was laid amid mixed emotions. Some shouted for joy at the restoration, while others who remembered the glory of Solomon's temple wept because the new structure seemed so inferior. The work was delayed by local opposition and by economic difficulties, but it eventually resumed under the encouragement of the prophets Haggai and Zechariah. The Second Temple was dedicated in 516 BCE, exactly 70 years after the destruction of the First Temple, fulfilling Jeremiah's prophecy of a 70-year exile. The Second Temple lacked several features of the First Temple, most notably the Ark of the Covenant. The Holy of Holies in the Second Temple was empty, containing only the foundation stone on which the Ark had once rested. The high priest still entered once a year on Yom Kippur, sprinkling blood and burning incense, but there was no ark to receive the blood, no mercy seat where God's presence dwelt between the cherubim. Other sacred objects were also missing. The fire that had descended from heaven to consume the first sacrifice at the temple's dedication, the Urim and Thummim that the high priest had used to determine God's will, the spirit of prophecy that had guided the nation. The Second Temple period was characterized by a sense of diminishment, of living in the shadow of former greatness, of waiting for the restoration that would bring back what had been lost. This sense is captured in the Book of Haggai, where God asks if anyone remembers the former glory of the temple, and acknowledges that in comparison, the new temple seems like nothing. Yet God promises that the glory of this latter house will be greater than the former, that he will shake all nations and fill this house with glory. The Second Temple stood for nearly 6 centuries, from 516 BCE to 70 CE, a longer span than the First Temple. During this period, it underwent significant modifications and expansions. The Persian period saw the temple restored and functioning under imperial patronage. The Greek period, following Alexander's conquest, brought new cultural influences that some Jews embraced and others resisted. The crisis of the Maccabean period, when the Seleucid king Antiochus IV Epiphanes desecrated the temple and prohibited Jewish worship, provoked a revolt that resulted in the rededication of the temple, an event still commemorated in the festival of Hanukkah. The Hasmonean dynasty that emerged from the revolt ruled Judea for about a century. combining royal and priestly authority in ways that some Jews found troubling. The Roman period began in 63 BCE, when Pompey conquered Jerusalem and, as mentioned, entered the Holy of Holies, finding it empty. The Romans initially ruled through client kings, most notably Herod the Great, who rebuilt the temple on a grand scale that surpassed even Solomon's original structure. Herod's temple, begun around 20 BCE and still under construction during Jesus' lifetime, was one of the largest religious structures in the Roman world, a monument to the wealth and ambition of its builder. Herod's Temple Mount was a massive platform supported by retaining walls, some of whose stones weighed hundreds of tons. The western wall, where Jews still gather to pray, is a portion of this retaining wall that survived the Roman destruction. The temple itself stood in the centre of the platform, surrounded by courts of increasing holiness: the court of the Gentiles, where anyone could enter; the court of women, beyond which women could not pass; the court of Israel for Jewish men; the court of the priests, where sacrifices were performed. The temple building followed the plan of Solomon's temple, with a vestibule, a holy place, and a holy of holies, but on a grander scale and with more elaborate ornamentation. The facade was covered with gold plates that reflected the rising sun with dazzling brightness. Josephus described it as appearing from a distance like a snow-covered mountain, and visitors from throughout the Roman world marvelled at its magnificence. Yet the Holy of Holies remained empty. The elaborate exterior concealed an absence at the centre, the missing ark that represented God's presence among his people. The destruction of Herod's temple by the Romans in 70 CE ended the sacrificial system that had been central to Jewish worship for a millennium. The temple was burned on the 9th of Av, the same date tradition assigned to the destruction of the first temple, a coincidence that reinforced the sense of tragic pattern in Jewish history. Josephus, who witnessed the destruction, described scenes of horror as the building burned and the Roman soldiers massacred the defenders. The treasures of the temple were carried to Rome, where they were displayed in the triumph of Vespasian and Titus, and deposited in the Temple of Peace. The Arch of Titus depicts these treasures, including the golden menorah and the silver trumpets, but not the Ark, which had been absent for over 6 centuries. After the destruction, the site of the temple remained in ruins. Jews were eventually forbidden to enter Jerusalem except on the anniversary of the destruction, when they could come to mourn. The Temple Mount was left desolate until the 7th century CE, when the Muslim conquerors built the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, structures that still stand today and that make the site holy to 3 religions. The theories about what happened to the Ark can be grouped into several categories: hidden, destroyed, taken, or supernatural explanations. The hidden theories hold that someone, probably a priest or king aware of the coming destruction, concealed the Ark in a secure location before the Babylonians arrived. The most common version places the hiding spot somewhere beneath the Temple Mount, in a chamber that has never been found or in tunnels that remain unexplored. Variations place the hiding spot on Mount Nebo in Egypt or in some other location outside Jerusalem. The appeal of the hidden theory is that it preserves the Ark's existence and holds out hope for its eventual discovery. The problem is that there is no direct evidence for any hiding, only the absence of evidence for destruction. The silence of the sources is consistent with hiding, but also consistent with other explanations. The destroyed theory holds that the Ark was destroyed along with the temple, either burned in the fire that consumed the building or broken up by the Babylonians for its gold. This explanation requires no special circumstances or hidden information. It assumes that the Ark met the same fate as the other temple furnishings. The problem is that the Babylonians were careful to inventory the treasures they took, and the Ark is not mentioned in that inventory. If they had destroyed it, we might expect some record of so significant an act. The taken theory holds that the Ark was carried away at some point, either by the Babylonians or by some earlier group. The Ethiopian claim falls into this category, suggesting that the Ark was taken to Ethiopia centuries before the Babylonian conquest. Other versions suggest that the Ark was taken to Babylon and lost there, perhaps destroyed when Babylon itself fell to the Persians, or that it was taken to Egypt by refugees fleeing the Babylonian invasion. The problem with the taken theory is the lack of evidence that the Ark arrived at any destination. No foreign source boasts of possessing it. No subsequent tradition clearly describes its presence outside Jerusalem. The supernatural explanation holds that the Ark was taken up to heaven, or miraculously hidden by divine agency, to be revealed only at the end of time. This explanation is consistent with certain Jewish traditions about Josiah hiding the Ark, or about the Ark's eschatological revelation. It removes the Ark from the realm of ordinary historical explanation and places it in the realm of faith. For believers, this explanation may be satisfying. For historians and archaeologists, it is not an explanation but an acknowledgement that no natural explanation is available. The Ark may have been subject to supernatural events, but historical investigation cannot assume or demonstrate such events. If the Ark was hidden beneath the Temple Mount, as many traditions suggest, then it lies in one of the most politically sensitive locations on earth. The Temple Mount is sacred to Jews as the site of the temple, to Muslims as the location of the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, and to Christians as the place where Jesus taught and predicted the temple's destruction. Any excavation beneath the surface would provoke enormous controversy, potentially violence. Israeli authorities have generally prohibited archaeological work on the Temple Mount itself, though excavations around its perimeter have revealed much about its history. The Muslim Waqf that administers the site has conducted its own construction and renovation work, sometimes over the protest of archaeologists who fear that ancient remains are being destroyed without documentation. The copper scroll from Qumran, mentioned earlier, has tantalized researchers with its list of hidden treasures. The scroll, found in 1952, is unique among the Dead Sea Scrolls in being written on copper, rather than leather or papyrus, and in containing not religious texts, but what appears to be a treasure map. It lists 64 locations where gold, silver, and other valuables are hidden, with total quantities that seem impossibly large. Some researchers have argued that the scroll describes real treasures hidden before the Roman destruction in 70 CE, perhaps including temple treasures. Others have argued that it is a literary work, a fictional treasure list perhaps related to legends about temple wealth. Attempts to locate the treasures described in the scroll have been unsuccessful, hampered by the vagueness of the geographical references and the changes in the landscape over 2,000 years. The scroll does not specifically mention the Ark, but if it describes real hidden treasures, the Ark might be among them, hidden in a location whose description we cannot understand or that has been destroyed by subsequent events. The search for the Ark continues in various forms, though serious archaeologists generally avoid claiming to have found it. The sensational claims that occasionally make headlines, such as radar scans allegedly showing a chamber beneath the Temple Mount, or expeditions claiming to have located the Ark in various remote locations, have not been confirmed by subsequent investigation. The Ark remains unfound, and it may remain unfound permanently. If it was destroyed, there is nothing to find. If it was hidden, the hiding place may be inaccessible, lost to earthquakes or construction, or so well concealed that it will never be discovered. If it was taken to some distant location, that location may never be identified. The mystery endures because the evidence is insufficient to resolve it, and because the Ark is too powerful a symbol to be forgotten. The Ark of the Covenant represents the presence of God among his people, the concrete evidence of a relationship between the divine and the human. Its loss represents the loss of that immediate presence, the transition from a God who dwelt in a specific place to a God who is worshipped everywhere and nowhere. For Jews, the lost Ark is part of the incompleteness of the present age, the gap between what was and what will be when the Messiah comes. For Christians, the Ark is a foreshadowing of Christ, and its loss is superseded by the greater presence of God in human flesh. For Muslims, the Ark is part of the sacred history of prophets that culminated in Muhammad. For all these traditions, the Ark carries meaning that transcends its physical existence, making its disappearance not merely a historical puzzle, but a theological statement about the nature of God's relationship with humanity. The religious practices associated with the Ark, particularly the Day of Atonement ritual, continued in modified form even after the Ark's disappearance. In the Second Temple period, the high priest still entered the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur, still sprinkled blood and burned incense, but he did so before the foundation stone rather than before the Ark. The elaborate ritual, described in detail in the Mishnah, involved multiple sacrifices, confessions of sin, and the dispatch of the scapegoat into the wilderness. The high priest would immerse himself multiple times, change his garments, and perform each step with precise attention to detail. A rope was reportedly tied to his ankle, so that if he died in the Holy of Holies, his body could be retrieved without anyone else having to enter the sacred space. The tension of the day was palpable. The entire community waited in prayer while the high priest entered the presence of God, and when he emerged safely, the relief was enormous. This ritual could continue without the Ark because its essential function was atonement for sin rather than interaction with a physical object. The blood was sprinkled toward the place where God's presence had dwelt, and that place retained its holiness even in the absence of the ark. The foundation stone, the Even Hashtia, was itself sacred, believed to be the point from which God had created the world, the navel of the earth, the rock on which Abraham had bound Isaac for sacrifice. This stone, which some identify with the rock beneath the dome of the rock, served as the focus for worship when the ark was no longer available. After the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, the Day of Atonement continued without either the ark or the temple rituals. The rabbis developed alternative forms of observance that focused on prayer, fasting, and repentance rather than on sacrifice. The prayers of Yom Kippur include extensive confessions of sin, recitations of the temple ritual that can no longer be performed, and petitions for forgiveness that rely on God's mercy rather than on the blood of animals. The central declaration of the day, the threefold recitation of the high priest's confession over the scapegoat, is recited by the congregation as they imagine the ancient ritual and affirm their participation in it across the centuries. The ark is mentioned in these prayers as part of the sacred history of Israel, part of the glory that was lost when the temple was destroyed, part of the hope for restoration in the Messianic age. The Jewish hope for the rebuilding of the temple necessarily includes hope for the restoration of the ark, though there is disagreement about whether this restoration will involve finding the original ark or constructing a new one. Some traditions hold that the original ark is hidden and will be revealed when conditions are right. Others hold that a new ark can be made according to the biblical specifications, just as a new temple can be built. The Temple Institute in Jerusalem has prepared many of the vessels and garments needed for temple worship, including a detailed plan for constructing a new ark. They argue that while the original ark would be preferred, the absence of the original does not prevent the restoration of temple worship. Bezalel built the first ark according to God's instructions, and modern craftsmen could do the same. The cherubim that guarded the ark represented a class of heavenly beings that appear throughout the Bible and ancient Near Eastern literature. In the Garden of Eden story, cherubim were stationed with a flaming sword to guard the way to the tree of life after Adam and Eve were expelled. Ezekiel's vision of the divine chariot described cherubim with 4 faces each, the face of a human, a lion, an ox, and an eagle, with 4 wings and wheels within wheels beside them. Isaiah's vision of God enthroned in the temple described seraphim, a related class of beings, with 6 wings covering their faces, their feet, and flying, calling out, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts." These heavenly beings served as God's attendants, guards, and throne bearers, mediating between the divine realm and the earthly realm. The cherubim on the ark were not merely decorative but functional, their wings creating the space where God's presence dwelt, their faces turned toward the mercy seat where the blood of atonement was sprinkled. The ark was thus a miniature representation of the heavenly throne room, a portable version of God's palace that allowed the divine presence to travel with the Israelites and dwell in their midst. The theological development of Israel's understanding of God's presence moved from highly localized to increasingly universal over the centuries recorded in the Bible. The earliest traditions depicted God appearing at specific places: the burning bush, Mount Sinai, the entrance of the tabernacle. The ark localized this presence further, containing it in a specific object that could be moved but that remained the unique locus of divine human encounter. Solomon's prayer at the temple dedication already questioned this localization, asking whether God could really dwell on earth when even heaven could not contain him. The prophets pushed further, emphasizing that God was present not only in the temple but throughout creation, that he heard prayer from any location, that he was with the exiles in Babylon just as he had been with their ancestors in Jerusalem. The loss of the ark and the temple forced Jewish theology to develop these insights fully, creating forms of worship that did not depend on physical location or sacred objects. God could be encountered in prayer, in study of Torah, in ethical action, anywhere and everywhere. This development did not mean that Jerusalem or the temple lost their significance. Jews continued to pray toward Jerusalem to hope for the temple's restoration, to mourn its destruction. But it meant that Jewish survival did not depend on possessing these things. The relationship with God could continue even when the physical symbols of that relationship were lost. Christianity interpreted the ark typologically, seeing it as a foreshadowing of Christ and of Christian realities. The ark contained the tablets of the law, the manna from heaven, and Aaron's rod that budded. Christ was the fulfillment of the law, the true bread from heaven and the eternal high priest. The mercy seat where God's presence dwelt and where atonement was made prefigured Christ as the place where God and humanity met and where sins were forgiven. The letter to the Hebrews develops this interpretation extensively, arguing that the earthly tabernacle was a copy of the heavenly sanctuary, that the sacrifices of bulls and goats could never truly take away sins, and that Christ's sacrifice accomplished once for all what the repeated sacrifices of the Levitical system could only anticipate. The ark was thus both historically real and symbolically superseded. Its disappearance signalled the end of the Old Covenant and the inauguration of the New. Some Christian traditions have also identified Mary as the Ark of the New Covenant, carrying Christ within her as the ark carried the tablets and manna. The visitation of Mary to Elizabeth parallels David's bringing of the ark to Jerusalem, with Elizabeth's greeting echoing David's question, "How is it that the mother of my Lord should come to me?" The ark's contents, law, bread, and priestly authority found their fulfillment in the one Mary carried. These interpretations did not create any Christian interest in finding the physical ark. If its meaning was fulfilled in Christ, then finding the object itself would be of only historical interest, a relic of the Old Covenant rather than a bearer of present power. The popular imagination has been captivated by the ark through films, books, and documentaries that blend history with adventure. The 1981 film Raiders of the Lost Ark, directed by Steven Spielberg and starring Harrison Ford as Indiana Jones, brought the ark to worldwide popular attention. The film imagined the ark as a weapon of tremendous power, capable of destroying Nazi armies with supernatural force. The climactic scene, where the ark is opened and the glory of God destroys those who look upon it, drew on biblical accounts of the ark's dangerous power while adding Hollywood spectacle. The film's portrayal of the ark as a box containing power that could be used by whoever possessed it was not quite faithful to the biblical conception, in which the ark was dangerous precisely because God himself dwelt upon it, not because it contained some impersonal force. Nevertheless, the film introduced the ark to millions who had never read the biblical accounts, creating a lasting cultural image of a golden chest with cherubim on its lid and enormous supernatural power. The film's sequel, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, focused on the Holy Grail rather than the ark, but the ark has remained a staple of adventure fiction and conspiracy theories ever since. The television documentary industry has produced numerous programs about the search for the ark, often mixing serious archaeological discussion with sensational claims and dramatic reenactments. These programs typically survey the various theories about the ark's fate, interview researchers with different views, and conclude without resolution, leaving the mystery intact for future programs to revisit. The format serves entertainment purposes better than educational ones. The lack of definitive evidence allows producers to present multiple theories as equally plausible, even when some are far more serious than others. Viewers learn that the ark might be in Ethiopia, or under the Temple Mount or on Mount Nebo, or in a cave in Jordan, without being given the tools to evaluate these claims critically. The mystery of the ark is good television, but good television is not always good history. The internet has democratized ark speculation, allowing anyone with a theory to publish it and find an audience. Some of these theories are thoughtful engagements with the evidence. Many are not. The Ethiopian claim, the Temple Mount theory, the Mount Nebo tradition, and various other serious proposals coexist with claims that the ark is held by the Vatican, that it was taken to America by pre-Columbian voyagers, that it is hidden in a cave beneath Jerusalem that emits radiation detectable by satellite, or that it was taken aboard an alien spacecraft. The lack of definitive evidence allows such theories to proliferate, as there is no way to definitively disprove most negative claims. The ark might be almost anywhere, or it might be nowhere, destroyed or decayed beyond recognition. The archaeological evidence for the biblical account of the ark is limited and indirect. No physical remains of the ark or any part of it have been found, which is not surprising given that it was probably either destroyed or hidden over 2,500 years ago. What archaeology has revealed is the broader context in which the ark existed. The material culture of ancient Israel, the temples and palaces of the ancient Near East, the religious practices of Israel's neighbours that illuminate and contrast with Israel's own practices. The Temple Mount itself, though largely inaccessible to archaeologists, has yielded information from excavations around its perimeter and from objects that have been carried away over the centuries. The stones of the Western Wall, the tunnels along its length, the steps where pilgrims climb to the temple, all provide tangible connections to the world where the Ark once stood. Beneath the visible surface lies a complex underground landscape of cisterns, chambers and tunnels, some ancient, some medieval, some modern, a labyrinth that has never been fully mapped and that may contain spaces that have not been entered for millennia. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered beginning in 1947, revolutionized our understanding of Judaism in the Second Temple period, but did not shed direct light on the Ark's fate. The scrolls mention the Ark in the context of biblical interpretation, and in the Temple Scrolls' idealized description of how the temple should be organized, but they do not claim that the community at Qumran possessed the Ark or knew its location. The scrolls do preserve traditions about the concealment of sacred objects, as in the Copper Scrolls treasure list, but these traditions cannot be verified against physical evidence. The period between the Babylonian destruction and the time of the scrolls, over 4 centuries, was long enough for accurate memory of the Ark's fate to be lost, and for legendary traditions to develop. The scroll writers may have known no more about the Ark than we do. They may simply have inherited the same traditions that later appeared in rabbinic literature. The archaeological site of Shiloh, where the tabernacle stood before David, brought the Ark to Jerusalem, has been excavated extensively. The excavations have revealed a settlement from the Iron Age period that corresponds to the biblical account, including what may be evidence of destruction corresponding to the destruction that Jeremiah mentioned. However, no physical evidence of the tabernacle or the Ark has been found, which is expected given that the tabernacle was a tent and the Ark was presumably removed before the site was destroyed. The excavations do confirm that Shiloh was a significant religious centre in the early Iron Age, consistent with the biblical account of its importance before David's time. Similarly, excavations at Beth Shemesh, where the Ark came when the Philistines returned it, have revealed an Israelite settlement from the appropriate period, but no physical evidence directly connected to the Ark. Archaeology can confirm the existence and general character of the places mentioned in the biblical narrative, but it cannot confirm the specific events or objects described. The construction of a replica Ark is technically possible, and has been done multiple times. The Temple Institute in Jerusalem has created a full-scale replica according to the biblical specifications, using acacia wood overlaid with gold and featuring cherubim on the mercy seat. This replica is intended as a prototype for the Ark that would be used in a rebuilt temple, demonstrating that the ancient craftsmanship is within modern capabilities. Other replicas have been made for museums, films, and religious communities, each interpreting the sparse biblical description according to their understanding. These replicas reveal the interpretive challenges involved. The biblical text specifies dimensions and materials, but leaves much to the imagination regarding the cherubim's appearance, the exact form of the carrying poles, and many other details. No replica can claim to reproduce the original exactly, and the theological significance of the original, the fact that it was made according to divine instruction and sanctified by God's presence, cannot be replicated by human craft alone. The question of what the Ark would mean if it were found is worth considering. For religious Jews who hope for the rebuilding of the temple, the discovery of the original Ark would be a sign of divine favour and perhaps a catalyst for restoration. The presence of the Ark would validate the temple site, confirm the continuity of Jewish tradition, and potentially enable the restoration of sacrificial worship. The practical and political obstacles to rebuilding the temple would remain enormous, given the Muslim holy sites currently on the Temple Mount, but the Ark's discovery would certainly intensify the pressure for some kind of Jewish access to the site. For Christians, the Ark's discovery would have historical and archaeological interest but limited theological significance, since Christian theology has consistently held that the Old Covenant was fulfilled and superseded in Christ. The Ark would be a relic of an earlier dispensation, fascinating to study but not necessary for worship. For Muslims, the Ark's discovery would confirm Quranic references to it and fit into the narrative of prophetic history that Islam shares with Judaism and Christianity. The political implications for control of the Temple Mount would be significant and potentially explosive. The scientific analysis that would be conducted if the Ark were discovered would aim to verify its age, origin, and composition. Radiocarbon dating could determine the age of the wood, though contamination and preservation issues could complicate the results. Analysis of the gold could reveal its source, potentially linking it to known ancient mines. Examination of construction techniques could compare the Ark with other ancient artifacts from the region. If the stone tablets were inside, analysis of the stone type and any inscriptions could provide crucial evidence for authenticity. The inscription of the Ten Commandments in ancient Hebrew would be one of the most significant epigraphic discoveries ever made, providing direct evidence of religious texts from the Mosaic period. The scientific and scholarly scrutiny would be intense, and any claimed discovery would need to withstand rigorous examination before being accepted as authentic. Given the history of archaeological fraud and exaggerated claims, the default position would be skepticism until overwhelming evidence supported authenticity. The night has grown long, and we have travelled together through the history of the most sacred object in the ancient world. We have followed the Ark from its construction at Mount Sinai, through the wilderness wanderings into the Promised Land where it led the armies of Israel to victory. We have seen it captured by the Philistines, who learned to their cost that the God of Israel was not a local deity to be trifled with. We have watched David bring it to Jerusalem with dancing and celebration, and Solomon install it in the temple he built, the golden chest beneath the wings of giant cherubim in the Holy of Holies. We have witnessed the centuries of kings, good and bad, of reform and apostasy, of foreign invasion and miraculous deliverance. And we have arrived at the mystery that has puzzled seekers for over 2,500 years. What happened to the Ark when the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem and burned the temple to the ground? The Ark is not mentioned among the treasures taken to Babylon. It is not recorded as destroyed in the fire. It simply disappears from the historical record, present in Solomon's temple, absent from the Second Temple, leaving behind only silence and speculation. Perhaps it was hidden beneath the Temple Mount by priests who foresaw the destruction, waiting in darkness for a restoration that has not yet come. Perhaps it was taken to Ethiopia by the son of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, guarded for millennia by monks who will not allow it to be seen. Perhaps it was carried to Mount Nebo by Jeremiah, hidden in a cave that remains undiscovered. Perhaps it was destroyed and we are searching for something that no longer exists. The mystery endures because the evidence is insufficient to resolve it, and because the Ark represents something that transcends physical existence, the presence of God among his people, the meeting point of heaven and earth, the visible symbol of an invisible relationship. Rest well tonight, and dream of ancient temples and golden treasures. Dream of priests in white robes entering the darkness of the Holy of Holies, of the glory of God filling the sanctuary with cloud and fire. Dream of the Ark travelling through the wilderness, going before the people of Israel as they followed their God into the unknown. Dream of the mystery that remains unsolved, the chest of acacia wood and gold that has been sought for millennia and never found. The Ark may be hidden in the depths of the earth or lost forever, but its meaning survives in the traditions that remember it. The God of Israel is present with his people, faithful to his covenant, promising restoration when all seems lost. That promise sustained the Jewish people through exile in Babylon and destruction by Rome, through medieval persecution and modern horror. It sustains them still as they pray at the Western Wall, the last remaining structure from the temple where the Ark once stood. Whatever happened to the gold and acacia wood, whatever fate befell the tablets of the law, the presence they represented was never lost, only transformed, found in prayer and study and faithful living where once it had been localized in a sacred box. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the ancient world. If you enjoyed this exploration, subscribe so you don't miss the next adventure. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from tonight. And if you drifted towards sleep as we walked through the courts of Solomon's temple and wondered what became of its most sacred treasure, that is exactly what these stories are for. The Holy of Holies is dark now, the Ark is gone, and all is quiet in Jerusalem. Good night. The ancient city of Jerusalem, where the Ark resided for centuries, was far smaller than the modern city, occupying only the ridge now called the City of David and the Temple Mount above it. The original Jebusite settlement that David conquered covered perhaps 12 acres, a fortified town with walls, a water system and buildings crowded together on the narrow ridge. David's conquest brought the city under Israelite control, but he did not immediately expand it. The Ark was placed in a tent, awaiting the temple that his son would build. Solomon's construction extended the city northward onto the Temple Mount, creating the sacred precinct that would become the heart of Jerusalem's identity. The Temple Mount was leveled and expanded through massive engineering works, creating a platform that could support the temple and its courts. Over the centuries, successive rulers continued to expand and modify the Temple Mount, culminating in Herod's massive construction that created the platform visible today. The water supply of ancient Jerusalem was a constant concern, as the city depended on the Gihon Spring, which emerged on the eastern slope of the ridge below the level of the walls. Access to this spring was essential for survival during sieges, and various water systems were constructed to provide protected access. The most famous of these is Hezekiah's Tunnel, a remarkable engineering achievement that brought water from the Gihon Spring to the Pool of Siloam inside the walls. The tunnel, carved through solid rock for over 500 meters, was completed around 700 BCE in preparation for an Assyrian siege. Workmen dug from both ends, meeting in the middle with an accuracy that still impresses modern engineers. An inscription found in the tunnel, now in the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, commemorates the completion of the project, one of the oldest Hebrew inscriptions ever found. This tunnel remains accessible today, a tangible connection to the world where the Ark stood in the temple above. The priests who served in the temple and who would have had responsibility for the Ark belonged to the tribe of Levi, and specifically to the descendants of Aaron, Moses' brother. The priesthood was hereditary, passing from father to son in families that maintained detailed genealogies, establishing their right to serve. The high priest, the only one permitted to enter the Holy of Holies, was drawn from a specific line within the priestly families. His duties included not only the annual Yom Kippur ritual, but also oversight of the entire temple operation, including the regular sacrifices, the maintenance of the sacred fire, and the interpretation of difficult cases using the Urim and Thummim. The high priest's garments were themselves sacred objects, including the ephod, a kind of vest decorated with precious stones representing the 12 tribes, and the breastplate, a pouch containing the Urim and Thummim, the mysterious objects used for divination. These garments were kept in the temple and worn only for priestly duties. The Levites who were not descendants of Aaron had subordinate roles in the temple service. They served as musicians, singers, gatekeepers, and assistants to the priests. They were responsible for the maintenance of the temple buildings and furnishings, for the slaughter and preparation of sacrificial animals, and for teaching the law to the people. The Levites had no territorial inheritance in the land of Israel. Instead, they were supported by the tithes of the other tribes, living in designated cities throughout the country, but serving in rotation at the temple in Jerusalem. This system ensured a perpetual supply of trained religious personnel while distributing them throughout the country, where they could serve local needs between their temple service rotations. The transportation of the Ark, when it needed to be moved, was specifically a Levitical responsibility. Only Levites could carry the Ark, using the poles inserted through its rings, and they were to cover it before moving it so that even they would not see it directly. The story of Uzzah's death when he touched the Ark to steady it served as a perpetual reminder that the Ark was not to be handled casually, that its holiness was dangerous to anyone who approached without proper authorization and preparation. The sacrificial system that operated in the temple was the primary means of worship in ancient Israel, a complex system of offerings for various purposes. The burnt offering, in which the entire animal was consumed on the altar, was the most complete form of dedication to God. The peace offering, in which parts of the animal were burned on the altar, and the rest was eaten by the worshipper and his family, was a meal shared with God that celebrated communion and thanksgiving. The sin offering and guilt offering addressed violations of divine law, providing means of restoration when the relationship with God had been damaged by sin. The grain offering accompanied animal sacrifices or could be offered independently, a gift of agricultural produce that acknowledged God as the source of all sustenance. These sacrifices were offered daily, weekly, monthly, and at the annual festivals, in addition to the voluntary offerings that individuals brought for various reasons. The annual festivals brought pilgrims to Jerusalem from throughout the land, and eventually from throughout the Jewish diaspora. Passover in the spring commemorated the exodus from Egypt, with families sacrificing lambs and eating them in a sacred meal. Shavuot, 7 weeks later, celebrated the wheat harvest and came to be associated with the giving of the Torah at Sinai. Sukkot in the fall was the harvest festival, when worshippers lived in temporary booths recalling the wilderness wandering and celebrated with palm branches and citrus fruits. On these occasions, the temple courts would be packed with worshippers, the air filled with the smoke of countless sacrifices, the sounds of music and prayer rising from the crowds. The Ark in the Holy of Holies was the invisible centre of all this activity, the place where God's presence dwelt, the reason why Jerusalem was the city where his name was placed. The music of the temple was an essential part of worship, with Levitical choirs and instrumentalists performing psalms and other sacred songs. The Book of Psalms preserves many of the songs used in temple worship, with superscriptions indicating the occasions for which they were intended, the musical modes in which they were to be performed, and the instruments that were to accompany them. The instruments included lyres, harps, cymbals, trumpets, and other instruments that are not always easily identified from the Hebrew terminology. The sound of the Levitical choir singing in the temple courts, accompanied by these instruments, must have been overwhelming, a wall of sacred sound that lifted worshippers out of ordinary consciousness and into the presence of the divine. When the Second Temple was destroyed, this musical tradition was largely lost, preserved only in written texts that could not capture the melodies or the experience of hearing them performed. The symbolism of the ark extended beyond its immediate religious function to represent the covenant relationship between God and Israel in its totality. The Hebrew word for ark, Aaron, simply means chest or box, the same word used for the coffin of Joseph. But the Ark of the Covenant was no ordinary container. It was the Aron Habrit, the chest of the covenant, or the Aron Herdut, the chest of the testimony, names that emphasized its role as the repository of the covenant documents and the witness to the agreement between God and his people. Every time the Israelites saw the ark, they were reminded of the obligations they had accepted at Sinai, the laws they were to follow, the relationship that defined their identity as a people. The ark was thus both a religious symbol and a national symbol, representing not only God's presence, but Israel's distinctiveness among the nations. The 10 Commandments that the ark contained represented the core obligations of the covenant. The first 4 commandments addressed the relationship between humans and God. No other gods, no images, no misuse of God's name, observance of the Sabbath. The remaining 6 addressed relationships among humans. Honor parents, do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not bear false witness, do not covet. These commandments were not unique in every detail. Prohibitions against murder and theft appeared in law codes throughout the ancient Near East. But their combination, their grounding in the will of a single God who demanded exclusive worship, and their placement at the foundation of a covenant relationship gave them distinctive significance. The stone tablets on which they were written symbolized their permanence and authority, inscribed by God himself according to the tradition, unalterable by any human hand. The manna that was kept in a jar within the ark, according to later tradition, commemorated the miraculous provision that had sustained the Israelites during the wilderness wandering. Manna appeared on the ground each morning like frost, collected before the sun melted it, providing exactly enough for each family's daily needs. On the day before the Sabbath, a double portion appeared, and that portion did not spoil overnight as the regular daily portion would. The manna ceased when the Israelites entered Canaan and began to eat the produce of the land, but the jar preserved in the ark maintained the memory of God's faithful provision. The presence of this manna in the ark reminded future generations that the God who had given the law had also given bread, that obedience was owed to a God who provided for his people, not to a distant deity who demanded without giving. Aaron's rod, the third item kept in the ark according to tradition, represented the legitimate authority of the priesthood. When a rebellion arose questioning Aaron's priestly status, God commanded that the staffs of the leaders of each tribe be placed overnight in the tabernacle before the ark. In the morning, Aaron's rod had sprouted, budded, blossomed, and produced almonds, a supernatural sign confirming his selection as high priest. The rod was then placed before the ark as a permanent reminder that the priestly authority was divinely instituted, not humanly chosen. This symbol of authority complemented the tablets of law and the jar of manna, the law given by God, the provision given by God, and the priesthood established by God, all contained within the ark that represented God's presence among his people. The journey of the ark through Israelite history paralleled the journey of the people themselves, from slavery to freedom, from wandering to settlement, from tribal confederation to monarchy, from independence to exile. When the ark moved, the people moved. When the ark rested, they rested. The ark led them into battle and sanctified their worship. It was captured and returned, demonstrating both the vulnerability and the power of the divine presence. It was brought to Jerusalem and installed in the temple, marking the transition from nomadic to settled worship. And finally it disappeared, leaving behind a void that could not be filled by any other object. The ark's journey ended, but the people's journey continued through exile and return, through destruction and rebuilding, through dispersion and regathering. The ark became a memory, then a hope, then a mystery, but the covenant it represented remained in force, written now on hearts rather than on tablets, carried in faithful lives rather than in a golden chest. The silence that surrounds the ark's disappearance is itself eloquent, speaking of trauma too great to articulate, of loss too profound to describe. The biblical writers who compiled the books of Kings and Chronicles knew how to narrate disasters. They described the fall of Samaria, the siege of Jerusalem, the burning of the temple in terms that still convey the horror of these events. Yet when it comes to the ark, they say nothing. The inventory of temple treasures taken to Babylon includes bronze and gold and silver vessels in meticulous detail, but the ark is not mentioned. The returning exiles rebuilt the temple and restored worship, but the Holy of Holies remained empty. This silence invites interpretation, but resists explanation. Did the writers not know what happened to the ark? Did they know but could not bear to tell? Did they believe the ark was hidden and did not want to reveal its location? Or did they simply take for granted that everyone knew what had happened, so that no explanation was necessary? We cannot answer these questions with certainty, and the silence remains, an empty space in the historical record that corresponds to the empty space in the Holy of Holies. The ark is gone, but the longing for God's presence remains, expressed in the prayers of Jews at the Western Wall, in the worship of Christians in churches built on holy sites, in the prostrations of Muslims in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The three great monotheistic religions all trace their roots to this small piece of land, to this city, to the temple that once stood where the golden dome now catches the sun. They disagree about many things, but they agree that this place matters, that something happened here that changed the world, that the presence of God touched earth in a way that cannot be forgotten. The ark was the focus of that presence for ancient Israel, and its memory continues to shape the religious imagination of billions of people. The archaeology of the Temple Mount continues to yield discoveries, though never the discovery that would settle the question of the ark. Excavations along the southern wall have uncovered the steps where pilgrims climbed to the temple, worn smooth by millions of feet over centuries. The Davidson Center displays artifacts from the temple period, including stones from the temple walls that were thrown down by the Romans, still bearing the marks of their fall. The Western Wall tunnels allow visitors to walk along the original street level, seeing the massive Herodian stones that formed the retaining wall of the temple platform. A stone inscribed with the Hebrew words "to the place of trumpeting" was found at the corner of the platform, marking where a priest had stood to blow the shofar announcing the beginning and end of the Sabbath. These discoveries bring us close to the world of the temple, but they do not bring us to the ark. The foundation stone, the Even Hashtaya, is traditionally identified with the rock that now sits at the center of the Dome of the Rock. This rock, roughly 50 feet by 40 feet, and rising several feet above the floor of the shrine, is sacred to Muslims as the place from which Muhammad ascended to heaven during his night journey. Jewish tradition holds that this is the rock on which Abraham bound Isaac for sacrifice, the rock that was the foundation of the world, the rock on which the ark rested in the Holy of Holies. If this identification is correct, then the place where the ark stood is known, even if the ark itself is not. Beneath the rock is a small cave, accessible by a stairway, that some have identified with the chamber where the ark was hidden. There is no evidence for this identification, but it illustrates how traditions accumulate around sacred sites, each layer adding to the significance of the place. The political complexity of the Temple Mount makes any resolution of the ark question unlikely in the foreseeable future. The site is administered by the Islamic Waqf under an arrangement dating from Israel's capture of the Old City in 1967. Non-Muslims can visit but cannot pray. Jews are allowed to ascend to the mount under police escort, but are not permitted to display religious articles or engage in worship. This arrangement, intended to preserve the status quo and prevent conflict, has satisfied no one completely. Religious Jews who wish to pray on the holiest site of their tradition are forbidden to do so. Muslims who fear Israeli encroachment on their holy places are vigilant against any change in the arrangements. Any proposal to excavate beneath the mount in search of the ark or any other artifact would be rejected by all parties as too provocative to contemplate. The mystery of the Ark may thus be preserved not by the difficulty of the search, but by the impossibility of conducting it. The wilderness of Sinai, where the Ark was first constructed, remains as harsh and beautiful as it was 3,000 years ago. The mountains where tradition places the giving of the law rise red and jagged against the blue sky, their slopes unmarked by vegetation, their wadis dry except during rare floods. Bedouins still move through this landscape as their ancestors did, following patterns of transhumance that predate recorded history. The monastery of St. Catherine, built in the 6th century CE, near what tradition identifies as Mount Sinai, preserves one of the oldest Christian communities in the world, its monks maintaining an unbroken presence for 15 centuries. The monastery's library contains ancient manuscripts, including some of the oldest biblical texts in existence, witnesses to the transmission of the scriptures that describe the Ark's construction and history. The burning bush, or a descendant of it, still grows within the monastery walls, a living link to the story that began when Moses turned aside to see why the bush was not consumed. Mount Nebo, where tradition holds that Jeremiah hid the Ark, rises from the plateau of Moab overlooking the Jordan Valley and the Promised Land beyond. From its summit on a clear day you can see Jerusalem, the city that Moses was permitted to view but not to enter. The view encompasses the entire sweep of biblical geography, from the mountains of Judea to the Dead Sea to the valley where Jericho lies below sea level. If the Ark were hidden on Mount Nebo, it would lie somewhere in this landscape, in one of the countless caves that pock the limestone hills, covered by the rubble of earthquakes and erosion. Explorers have searched these caves without success, but the terrain is vast and the caves are many, and it is possible that some have never been entered by modern researchers. The tradition recorded in 2nd Maccabees may preserve genuine memory of a hiding place that has never been found, or it may be legend explaining the Ark's absence by placing it in a location associated with Moses' death. Ethiopia, where the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion claims to possess the Ark, is a land of ancient Christian tradition, its church tracing its origins to the conversion of the Ethiopian eunuch by the Apostle Philip in the Book of Acts. The Ethiopian church developed in relative isolation from the churches of the Mediterranean world, maintaining distinctive practices that some scholars believe preserve very early Christian and even Jewish traditions. The claim to possess the Ark fits this pattern of ancient distinctiveness, connecting Ethiopia to the biblical narrative in a way that legitimized the Ethiopian monarchy and placed Ethiopia at the center of sacred history. The annual Timkat celebration, commemorating the baptism of Jesus, features processions of the tablets, the replicas of the Ark that every Ethiopian church possesses, wrapped in rich cloth and carried on the heads of priests. These processions give a vivid sense of what Ark veneration might have looked like in ancient Israel, with crowds following the sacred object, music and dancing accompanying its movements, the presence of God made visible in the streets. The search for the Ark of the Covenant will continue as long as people care about the Bible and its history, as long as the mystery remains unsolved, as long as the hope for discovery motivates explorers and dreamers. Whether the Ark will ever be found is impossible to say. If it was destroyed, there is nothing to find. If it was hidden, the hiding place may be beyond discovery. If it was taken to a distant land, that land may never yield its secret. But the search itself is valuable, not because it is likely to succeed, but because it keeps alive the memory of what the Ark represented. The Ark was the meeting place of heaven and earth, the visible sign of an invisible presence, the concrete symbol of an abstract relationship. Its loss forced a theological development that ultimately enriched rather than impoverished the traditions that remembered it, and its mystery continues to fascinate, inviting each generation to wonder what happened to the golden chest that once held the presence of God. The night is late now, and these ancient stories have carried us far from the concerns of ordinary life. We have walked with the Israelites through the wilderness, the Ark going before us, the cloud of God's presence guiding by day, and the pillar of fire by night. We have stood with Joshua as the walls of Jericho fell, the Ark circling the city until the trumpets blew and the shout went up. We have mourned with the priests as Jerusalem burned and the temple collapsed in flames, the Ark's fate unknown then and unknown still. We have hoped with the exiles who dreamed of return, who prayed toward a ruined city and believed that God would restore what had been lost. And we have wondered, as countless others have wondered, what happened to the most sacred object in the ancient world. The answer remains hidden, perhaps in a cave beneath Jerusalem, perhaps in a church in Ethiopia, perhaps in dust scattered so completely that nothing remains to find. But the question endures, and the wonder it evokes is itself a kind of treasure, a gift from the ancient world to all who pause to receive it. Thank you for listening, for wondering, for drifting towards sleep with these ancient dreams. The Holy of Holies is empty now, the curtain torn, the ark long gone. But the God who dwelt between the cherubim still lives, still hears the prayers of those who seek him, still meets with those who come in faith. Good night, and may your sleep be peaceful, your dreams filled with golden light and ancient mystery. The influence of the ark on religious architecture extended far beyond ancient Israel, shaping the design of synagogues, churches, and mosques in ways that often go unnoticed. The Torah ark in a synagogue, the cabinet where the Torah scrolls are kept, represents a direct continuation of the ark tradition, a container for sacred texts that is the focus of worship and toward which prayers are directed. The ark is typically placed on the wall facing Jerusalem, so that worshippers face both the scrolls and the holy city when they pray. The ark is often decorated with symbols recalling the temple, lions representing Judah, crowns representing the Torah, columns recalling Jachin and Boaz. When the ark is opened and the scrolls are removed for reading, the congregation rises in respect, acknowledging the presence of God's word as their ancestors acknowledged the presence of God himself. Christian churches developed their own architectural traditions that echo the temple layout, with a nave corresponding to the outer court, a chancel corresponding to the holy place, and an altar or sanctuary corresponding to the Holy of Holies. The altar where the Eucharist is celebrated represents the place of divine presence, approached with reverence and set apart from the congregation by rails or screens. Eastern Orthodox churches maintain the iconostasis, a screen of icons that separates the sanctuary from the nave, recalling the curtain that separated the Holy of Holies from the holy place. The tabernacle in a Catholic church, where the consecrated host is reserved, is another echo of the ark, a container for the presence of Christ kept in the holiest part of the building. These architectural features create sacred spaces that shape the experience of worship, guiding the movements and attitudes of worshippers in ways that connect them to ancient patterns. Islamic architecture, while developing from different sources, also reflects the temple tradition in certain ways. The mihrab, the niche in a mosque that indicates the direction of Mecca, serves as the focus of prayer in somewhat the way the ark served as the focus of Israelite worship. The reverence shown to the Quran, kept in decorated stands and handled with ritual care, parallels the reverence shown to the Torah scrolls and, before them, to the tablets in the ark. The Dome of the Rock, built over the traditional site of the temple's Holy of Holies, incorporates the sacred geography of the Jewish tradition into the Islamic sacred landscape, acknowledging the holiness of the place even while giving it new significance. The three Abrahamic religions, for all their differences, share this inheritance from ancient Israel, this sense that certain spaces and objects can be set apart as holy, can serve as meeting points between the human and the divine. The Ark of the Covenant, lost for over 2,500 years, continues to exercise its fascination over the human imagination. It represents the possibility of direct encounter with God, the concrete presence of the divine in the material world. Its loss represents the absence that characterizes much of human religious experience, the sense that God is hidden, that the sacred is elusive, that the meeting places of heaven and earth are hard to find. The search for the ark is in some ways a search for that lost immediacy, that direct access to the divine that the ark represented. Whether or not the physical object can be found, the longing it represents remains, the human desire to know God, to encounter the sacred, to find the place where heaven touches earth. The stories we tell about the ark, whether in ancient scriptures or modern films, express this longing in narrative form. The ark that led Israel through the wilderness, that brought down the walls of Jericho, that struck the Philistines with plague and Uzzah with death, is an object of tremendous power, dangerous and holy and utterly unlike anything else in the world. To possess the ark was to possess the presence of God, with all the responsibility and peril that implied. To lose the ark was to lose that presence, to be left with memory and hope, but not with the immediate reality of divine dwelling. The power of the ark's stories lies in their portrayal of a God who is both near and far, both present and hidden, both approachable and dangerous. This paradox is at the heart of religious experience, and the ark embodies it in physical form. As sleep approaches and the day's concerns fade into the background, let the mystery of the ark accompany you into dreams. Imagine the golden chest beneath the wings of the cherubim, the cloud of glory filling the temple, the high priest emerging from the Holy of Holies with the news that atonement has been made and sins have been forgiven. Imagine the ark travelling through the wilderness, the pillar of cloud by day and fire by night, the people following where God led. Imagine the silence of the empty Holy of Holies in the Second Temple, the foundation stone marking the place where the ark had once rested, the prayers offered toward an absence that was also a presence. The ark may be lost, but the God of the ark is not lost. He hears the prayers of those who seek him, wherever they are, whatever their tradition, in the quiet of the night when all other voices fall silent. The mystery of the ark is finally the mystery of God himself, present and hidden, near and far, known and unknown. Rest now in that mystery and let it carry you into peaceful sleep,